Hi, this is David Raiklen, and welcome to NACUSA-LA. This is our weekly conversation on topics interest to composers, and our topic this week is contemporary orchestration. We're going to listen to some wonderful music and look at the scores and learn how to create those amazing techniques for our own music. And everyone is welcome to ask questions either after the music stops, or you can put them in the chat. So if you could be kind enough to mute yourself until you're ready to speak, that would be great. And also, if there's any technical issues, please put those in the chat, and then either I will see it or Jeannie will see it, and we'll try and fix it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Finally, there it is. Okay. We're going to start with one of my favorite pieces that is by a Japanese composer named Toru Takemitsu. And there's all kinds of wonderful creative orchestration in this work. But I'm going to concentrate on just a few really interesting effects. And what I'm going to do for each one is play it, and then we'll discuss it, then we'll play it again. Now, could everybody hear that? Okay, good. Now you can see that this is a small ensemble, and if we look at the notes, you see that everybody is playing in the middle or above the treble staff. There's no bass clef notes, no bass range notes, but the sound is very well balanced. So how does that happen? Everybody is playing up from, middle of treble staff to even higher. So how does that get balanced? Well, can you see the pointer on the screen? Can you see my pointer? Okay. All of these notes are supported by that B natural at the bottom of the piano's roll up. Well, there's also an interesting dynamic marking here. You see that the way he notates a crescendo in the piano roll is he has the hairpin pointing up, which makes it even more remarkable that we're able to get a well-balanced chord that doesn't sound too trebly when the bass note is a piano, soft volume piano note. So let's listen again and see if you can hear that low B, because I can hear it pretty well. All right, so you can see that the vibraphone down here also has that note very, very softly, but that's probably not contributing very much. So here's kind of the orchestration tip here, is that you can have lots of high register notes that are played softly, and you can balance them with just one or two notes that are still in the treble range, but just lower than the rest. Now, nobody taught me that in orchestration, either in school or in professional score. The truth, it's how you can make a really trebly heavy orchestration sound well balanced. Is with just one soft note. Okay, now we're going to go a little bit further ahead in this piece, and we're going to take a look at how to create a very complex texture with only 3 instruments and without asking anyone to do anything really hard. I'm just going to play through. See, doesn't that sound really dense and full? It's only 3 instruments, and it starts quite soft, but then it gets really dense and full sounding. So how's he doing that? This one we should listen to again because it's really pretty intricate. Okay, so let's look at how that's done. Well, it starts very simple with the pianissimo vibraphone. And that's enough to get a little cloud of sound happening, but it's not too complex. And then the vibraphone just tremolos on that low D. So these notes are ringing a little bit, but the only thing that's sustaining is that low D until they have their little flourish there. So next we have the piano. Again, the tempo here is very slow. So even though these are 30-second notes, they're going by at a modest speed. And the piano has this little arpeggio here, and then another little arpeggio here, and that's it. But when you add those 2 short arpeggios to that rolling vibraphone, it starts to increase the sense of complexity because they're moving quickly and because they're in a different timbre, in a different register. And then the harp has a gliss. And again, this is not a complicated or difficult to execute glissando. But by having the harp glissando added to that arpeggio, this creates a sense of great complexity. And right after we get that presentation of the harp plus the piano while the vibe is just rolling, then the vibe plays a little virtuosic flourish. And the total effect of all of this is that the music is really complex, but it's actually not really complex at any one time. Each player is doing something that's just requires a relatively small amount of practice to get it right. But when you put the 3 of them together, each one doing something complex and different, one after the other, the impression is of great complexity. So let's listen to it one more time. Okay, so any questions on this, or can we move on? All right, now we're going to take a listen to one of Toru's specialties, which is blending Western and Eastern aesthetics and sounds in the same piece. And we'll move ahead to 428. Wait a minute, 418, sorry. Now, to me, that has a very Eastern Japanese flavor to it, even though there's no Japanese or any Asian instruments playing there. So what's going on? Well, let's take a look at the harp part again. This is a prepared harp. It's not prepared in a complex way, but what he's asked is for the harpist to detune certain pitches so they're not equal tempered. So that gives the harp certain notes that have a very Eastern pentatonic, not in the not on the white keys or the black keys, but in between the keys, kind of sound. And when the harp is playing glissandi, you don't really notice those slightly out of equal tempered notes so much. But when he plays them, or she plays them individually, you start to hear that quality. Another technique is this thing that kind of looks like a half moon or a nail. That's playing the harp strings with the nail, which makes it sound much more like it's like a Kyoto, or something that's plucked with a plectrum. So the combination of the detuned notes and the playing with nails gives it a sense that you're listening to a piece of Asian music that's tuned in a different system and is using a different kind of instrument. And then the flute, it's an alto flute, which is more in the register of Eastern instruments that are, wood flutes, like a shakuhachi. So again, this is using a Western flute, but it has just enough of that Eastern flavor. So let's listen to it one more time. Okay, so any questions on getting that Eastern sound from Western instruments? Okay, good. So now let's move to our next piece, and there it is. Okay, this one we're just going to play from the top. And this is my kind of plea for the saxophone as part of chamber groups or the orchestra. It's pretty rare to hear saxophones in the context of an orchestra unless it's like bolero or pavane. And I've heard some well-established composers saying that if they want to write for saxophone plus orchestra, it's a really hard sell because there's this widespread misconception that saxophones don't blend well with the rest of the orchestra. And I'd like to put that myth to rest. And this is by Alan Theisen. What we're going to hear is just a solo flute and a solo alto saxophone. In unison. That sounds perfectly balanced to me. I don't have any issues with there's not enough flute or the saxophone is sticking out. They seem like they're beautifully blended. That's because saxophones are woodwind instruments and they blend beautifully with woodwind instruments. If you've got a good saxophonist, they don't have to have a loud brassy sound. They can have a very subtle sound and easily blend with other instruments. And I chose flute here because that's the one that you'd think would have the most problems, perhaps, with balance, is the loud saxophone with the soft flute, especially the soft flute is playing at the bottom of the register triple piano. But the saxophone doesn't have any problem with matching that. So there you go. Saxophones are woodwind instruments and they blend perfectly well with the rest of the woodwind instruments.
I would only point out that I think that charge is leveled more in full orchestrations, not just a couple of sparse instruments, in defense of the people who make that claim.
Yes, however, the full orchestration is even easier to balance. This is really hard because there's only the two of them and they have to balance perfectly. If the saxes are a little bit louder in the context of, balancing with 12 or 14 other woodwinds, then that makes it easier to get the balance. They don't have to be quite so perfectly balanced. Okay, and now I'm going to give another example of this from Piccolos and Plungers by John Berners. He's a composer at the University of Indiana. Okay, so let me enlarge this so it's a little easier. And again, please let me know if you're having any trouble seeing or hearing, and I'll try and adjust. And yes, we actually have a score here that's in manuscript, or at least pencil, pen. Now we're going to have a soprano sax balancing with a piccolo. And maybe at first glance or first hearing, you might say, that's unlikely to work, but you can see it works just great.
Orchestrator obviously lost a bet.
There's also some other instruments here but it's kind of interesting to hear how it all blends together. There's also a trumpet and a trombone, and again, the piccolo is able to balance. Now that's kind of a fun piece. And again, to me, that sounds really well balanced. When it's just the piccolo and the soprano sax, they sound like they're really well balanced. And this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. That first one was, really soft and subdued and slow, and this is really loud and fast. And yet they balance beautifully. So saxes can play really nicely with other woodwind instruments. And you get some really fun and interesting timbres that way. So again, maybe you guys already knew this, but I see very few examples of people writing like this, and I think it's because they just assume that it won't balance, but it does. It's just that you need a couple of musical performers, or however many, and again, we could do this with a larger ensemble, but I wanted to show that even when you're just down to one person on a part, that they can still have enough control to balance beautifully, even with extreme registers of the instruments. Okay, now for something really different, at least compared to what we've been doing. We're going to listen to some vocal music. And let's see, I think I need to enlarge the screen for this one. Oh, sorry. Just a little bit. Okay. Now here's an interesting vocal technique, and let's just listen. Oops, come on. There we go. Isn't that cool? If you close your eyes and just listen to the sound, don't look at the notation, just close your eyes and listen to the sound, and then look at the notation, and it's kind of startling how simple it is to get that sound. Okay, so when I listen to that, it sounds kind of reminiscent of the micropolyphony of Ligeti, or some kind of aleatoric piece where the musicians are singing a lot of different notes, a lot of different pitches to create that ethereal, pulsating, complex texture. But instead, they're just singing long, sustained notes, but they're doing like a recit, you know, where they're saying words on a pitch. And because they're not synchronized, in other words, the singers are all saying the same words, but at different times, it gives this kind of bubbling, scintillating texture that's really fascinating and complex, but relatively easy to execute. Now, Adrian or one of the other people who really know singing could comment more on this, but I think this is kind of remarkable, where you can get these wonderful complex textures just by asking the players to hold a note and then speak on it, on that pitch. Okay, and this is a little bit of orchestration, a little bit of composition. But if you want to know how to sound like Eric Whitacre, you know, his one of his characteristic harmonic moves that's so beloved by singers and audiences around the world, this is a really simple, cool example of it. Okay, so that's a very characteristic, frequently used technique. Let's see what he's doing there. Okay, the sopranos and the altos are doing triadic harmony here, with the E minor probably being the best name for this chord, because there's a little bit of that hanging in the room from the basses. So that's an E minor triad, and then we get a little bit more complex. Now it's an E7. But you can see when the men come in, they're doing spread triads. And even though they're moving, it's all in parallel motion. So these are all spread triads on C, D, and E. So the triadic idea is continuing in the men, while the women, divisi, just going down a step to create a cluster. And that balance between the spread triads and the cluster is really characteristic of his sound. He doesn't do it on every note, but on every phrase, he will do something like that. And it creates a certain piquancy to the sound when you add those brief little clusters to the triadic harmony. It makes it more interesting to the ear, at least for a moment. And even though it's quite dissonant, in this context, it doesn't bother even sensitive ears. So let's listen to it again, and we'll see another example of it in the next little phrase. You see, he does it again here on the third note of the phrase, where he has that rub between the E and the F sharp, but just for that one note. So this is more voicing and registers, but I think it counts as part of orchestration. So there's something you can do to modernize the sound of your vocal harmonies while still sounding tonal and being accessible, being strategic where you add your dissonances, and making sure that part of the voicing is tonal and consonant, and then part of it that's dissonant, and that sort of softens it just enough so it doesn't bother people that you're getting dissonant there. It just sounds like poignant harmony. Okay, so next we're going to look at using division of labor to create complex world rhythms. And this is full of wonderful compositional ideas. Talk about that in just a second, but let's see, we're going to 238. Now, one way you can get complex, exciting world rhythms is to hire Peter Erskine and Vinnie Collier and have them just go for it. Tell them you want an exciting world groove, and they'll just play it. Or you can get some other great kit player and multi-percussionist, and they can do it. But what if you don't have access to that, or you want to do it in a more orchestral context? Well, here's how you do it. So that's pretty complex rhythm there, I would say. But each person is playing a relatively straightforward repeating pattern that they can just lock into. Oh, and that's also another interesting orchestrational tip there, is that when you've got percussion that's that busy, then just adding one pitched instrument to it is like a mind-expanding, very powerful thing to do, a great compositional move, because the sound of the pitched instrument and the sound of the harmony just jumps out of the texture because it's so different. So relatively straightforward, a simple idea, and we see this in scores, going back centuries of, dividing up the percussion parts of different instruments. But you can do that with very hip, modern world music rhythms, and just break it down so you have 4 percussionists or 5 percussionists playing each a different part that interlocks. And it sounds like you've got, this grooving Afro-Cuban section there in the back, when it probably could be done maybe even by a community orchestra if they wanted to practice. If you're really into rhythm, or even if you're not, I suggest that after this evening's conversation, that you go ahead to the section at bar 140 to about bar 180. And there's some amazing creativity and excitement with rhythm there. And again, it's done by having each part being relatively playable, but interlocking with another part that adds another level of excitement and complexity. So the composite, when they combine. This is P.Y.T. with the Jacob Collier arrangement. And again, this is on YouTube, so you can check it out. And it's really a lot of fun, and also brings up an interesting point that we could have a whole other session on, that if an arrangement is sufficiently creative and full of original material, then shouldn't the arranger also get compositional credit? And I'll just leave it at that and give this as an example where the arrangement has so much original material in it that, well, it's kind of its own piece. Oh, and also this has the bonus of you get to hear Quincy Jones sing. While we're on percussion, we'll move to another, what do we call it? Percussive adventure. And this is where we have our pitched instruments making percussive sounds, or as percussive a sound as they can make. And we all know about Collier bowing, or tongue thrusts on the flute, or you know, slapping the piano, and those are all, you know, percussive sounds that come from individual instruments. But what happens when you get a whole group of different instruments, each making their own percussive efforts, and you combine them? And then you get something that might sound like this. So what the heck is that? I mean, if you weren't looking at the score and you just heard that, you'd probably have the same reaction I did when I first heard it. What is making all of those sounds? And it's acoustic instruments. Oh, he does use electronics in other parts of the piece. So there are percussion instruments there. So we do have, you know, a snare drum and a tom playing, but that's only a small part of the texture. We've got the cello playing tremolo and overbowing. That is, you know, they're pressing really hard on the bow, so it has a more scratchy, noisy kind of sound to it. And we've got the flute, and they're doing flutter tonguing, and again, they're overblowing, so there's a lot of air in there. And interesting effect here, there's an accordion, and they're doing a bellows shake. And that's where you hold on to the accordion and push down a bunch of keys so you get a good solid grip on it, and then you just quickly shake it back and forth. And it works even better on a bandoneon if you have access to that. That makes an even cooler bellows shake. And so you add all that together and you get this. So I think that's pretty cool. wouldn't necessarily want to, listen to that for 15 minutes straight, but I think it's an interesting, very contemporary sounding texture that's actually pretty straightforward to do. You're not asking the players to do anything that's especially virtuosic or difficult, although again, they'll need a little rehearsal to balance the sounds of the different instruments when they're, doing these simple but extended techniques. Now let's move on to something orchestral. Okay, now this is one where instead of looking at the score, I'd like you to, look away at your phone, close your eyes, just listen to the sound for a second and then see how it's notated. Okay, so let's go back and now look at the score if you hadn't before, and see what's going on there. I'll tell you, when I first heard this, my impression is that this had to be atonal and aleatoric, because the texture is so complex and ever-changing, and it's hard to find any sense of a pitch center. So the effect is that we're listening to atonal chance music, but it's actually completely notated. It's completely deterministic. Everybody is moving around to a different note, and they're not playing the same note at the same time. So that gives the pitch variety. And because these are double basses and cellos that are playing low, this is like an octave lower than what's written. All of the overtones that come out of those low bass and cello notes make it sound like the instrument is doing something much more complex, because you don't hear a clean single pitch. You get a little cloud of overtones and of some filtered noise that's on every note of every instrument. So yes, if you really listen closely, if you're real experienced listener of atonal music, you'd be able to tell that this really wasn't 12 tones. It was only less than that, but it's only 6, and that this isn't aleatoric, but it's actually rhythmic. The thing is that you have to be a really experienced listener and know what you're listening for to tell that. So this is a very a straightforward way that you can rehearse without a lot of time spent on the notation and explaining to people how they're supposed to do it. Because in this context, if somebody makes a mistake, it's really hard to tell, because it's already so busy and dense that, yeah, you want people to try and play together, but if they make a mistake, it won't hurt the effect that you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, this is a very clever way to get some of the flavor and effects of serial music without having to resort to complex compositional techniques or putting extreme demands on the performer.
Who is the composer?
This is John Williams.
I've heard of him.
Yes. He's talented. If you're counting 8, then you're probably right. I may be thinking of the section that's coming up next.
Ah,
I counted 12 back there.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Yeah.
then that might be one of the 12-tone sections, and my apologies if I've misrepresented that.
Well, you've been perfect so far.
Thank you. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot. It's back here earlier in the piece that he uses only 6 tones, and then as he gets more towards the climax, then he starts using more tones. So you're right. That's part of the structure of the piece, is that it gets more 12-tone as it builds towards the climax. And then after the climax, everything becomes tonal.
And what is this piece, David?
This is the music for Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Wow.
And it's one of the masterpieces of 20th century music, in my opinion, and it's really worth studying. There's just some amazingly creative orchestrational and harmonic and just compositional devices that he's distilled into something that you could play for an audience of millions, and they could relate to it. It doesn't go over people's heads. I mean, I've heard him play this at the Hollywood Bowl, if you can believe that. So that sounds pretty darn complicated, doesn't it? And yet if you look at each part, they're not doing anything that's that virtuosic. Yeah, it's tricky, you need good players, but this is not, high-speed 12-tone music that really requires a virtuoso ensemble to play, although he does have a virtuoso ensemble playing this. Instead, he's got, all these repeated notes happening in all of the parts, but they don't stick out that much. And, when you're learning 12-tone technique, you're told you shouldn't have repeated notes because they're going to stick out. But at this tempo and in this register, not so much. And, he's got the Gran Casa doing a roll there to add a little bit to it. But, most of the texture is just coming, again, from having a bunch of strings playing little riffs over and over again, but everybody's got a different riff and they're all playing it simultaneously. So let's just hear how that builds, that whole section builds starting right at the beginning. So again, a sense of enormous complexity that's achieved by relatively simple means. So any questions?
How did he do that? Amazing. Wonderful.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, I think how he did it was, believe it or not, I actually got to work with John Williams just a couple of years after he wrote this. And Steven Spielberg wanted something that sounded like the soundtrack to 2001. And so what John did was he looked at those techniques and simplified them. So you could execute them with a Hollywood studio orchestra fairly quickly. And it worked, because if he had gone to that, Penderecki, Ligeti level of complexity, it would have been possible for the studio orchestra to play it, but it would have taken him a long time to learn it. So I think this was just his way of saying, okay, how can I achieve these effects in a practical way where I won't break the budget, but it'll still have that sense of, whirling, ever-growing complexity and completely unpredictable and timbres that people don't normally hear in a movie. And let's see, there's also one other thing I want to show here. Okay, here it is. I am going to find it. All right. Someone was asking me, how do you notate the typical Hollywood horror and suspense effects? And here's a really excellent example. This is something that people have been doing basically since the 60s. And in a way, this is an answer to the question, how long a glissando can you create with the orchestra, assuming you're not allowed to use a pedal steel guitar? There's a good trivia question. What instrument makes the longest possible glissando? It's a pedal steel guitar. But assuming you don't have that, how do you get that with an orchestra? Start with the trombones, and you add the cellos and the violas. So that's a pretty long, continuous, slow glissando. And the way he does it is he just, again, it's division of labor. He's having different choirs of instruments pick up the glissando so it never stops. And, you can embellish that so, the strings could be tremoling and the brass could be flutter tonguing, so you can make it, even more intense. And here he's just using, dyads and triads to slide up on. But if you make the clusters closer together, so they're semitones apart, that makes it even more intense and scary. Okay. Again, this is a wonderful score that's worth studying. It's so full of good ideas and wonderful performances. And if you want to have an alternate performance, besides the composer conducting, Zubin Mehta did a great version of Close Encounters with the LA Phil. And I highly recommend that one as well. Okay, and now we're going to listen to what might be called fusion music. This is kind of a fusion between chamber music, jazz, and metal. What we're going to listen to is for a very interesting doubling of electric guitar and acoustic piano. Okay, I'm going to stop that because the first time through, that's kind of dizzying and a little difficult to absorb. Well, also I should tell you, this is Tigran, Hamasyan, and Abasi. And I forget the name of the drummer. Tigran is an Armenian jazz composer, and Abasi is an American heavy metal guitarist. But they're both very experimental. They try and expand the realm of what's possible. So, and also the bass guitar part here is an overdub by Tosin. He's also playing bass guitar as well as the electric guitar. So let's listen to that again, but on second listen and second look, maybe it'll be a little easier to digest. Great fun, though. Let's find out. Yeah, there we go. So pretty cool, huh? First, you can hear the incredible precision and virtuosity that's possible with doubling piano with guitar. I mean, that's about as fast and furious as you'd ever want anybody to play, and they're playing in unison, and it's crystal clear. And yet they can also play those sustained chords, and those also work. So this is a doubling that's very cool. And obviously you don't have to do something that's, you know, a virtuoso showpiece like this to take advantage of that. That electric guitars can play nice with acoustic instruments. And you can also do the reverse, by the way, although that's more common, is to have an electric keyboard playing with an acoustic guitar. And that also works. And again, you can get wonderful precision blend between the keyboard and the guitar. Although with the acoustic guitar, unless they're playing through an amp, you don't get those wonderful sustained sounds that I think are just exquisite. The sound of the piano resonance with the electric guitar resonance is just beautiful. And that would be more evident if the drummer weren't also playing. And So the name of this track is Vortex. Tigran, Hamasyan, and Tosin Abasi. Let's see if I go back to the top. See the title. I think. Maybe, yeah, there we go. Oh, and this is the newest music. This music came out less than 6 months ago. This is brand new. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and ask if anybody has any questions or comments or suggestions.
Just was going to say that when you hear the electric guitar with the piano, it almost sounds like a synthesizer at times. It's interesting. I mean, when it got into the higher register, it started to sound like Main Street Electrical Parade. But unbelievably good. I mean, just great stuff. Thanks, David. Really great stuff.